Thank you, Srividya. I hope you're able to hear me. Okay. So thank you and welcome to our esteemed panelists and the distinguished audience for this session on funding and innovation for R&D. I know it's getting quite late, especially for the folks out here in India, but it's an exciting session. So please do stay tuned in. In fact, we were supposed to start with some comments by Mr. Anurag Jain, Secretary DPIIT, but he's not able to make it today, unfortunately. But just to set the context before we move to the panel, as part of the committee, the R&D committee that worked on inputs to the government, it was led by Mr. Pankaj Patel, to enable the policy on R&D and innovation, and also on incentivizing and funding research. Several of the panelists that you will see on the session, this session today, they had contributed to these deliberations, and I would especially like to thank them for that at the very outset. Let me start off by saying that all of us do know the difficulties and also the risks that are associated with research, especially when it comes to the investments that we put behind it. It's risky when it comes to the long gestation, the failure rates involved in research, especially on the drug discovery side, the complexity that we talked about on regulations, and all of these things are known, but all the same, it's very important. Drug discovery of time, and when it comes to experience in the discovery, we at Dr. Reddy's have gone through it. There are several startups who are going through it, several industries, academic institutions, and I must say it is difficult. It's because it's just not one piece. When it comes to investments, but it's a whole ecosystem itself that needs to come together when it comes to enabling innovation. Especially if I see it from the eyes of a the scientist entrepreneur, who has an idea, all he needs is not just a lab. He certainly needs more than. Sorry about that. He obviously needs more than just a backing of an institution to take it forward. And we just heard from Dr. Paul and Madam Aparna and Dr. Vijay Raghavan, and also in the various regulatory sessions, a scientist should be working on progressing the idea and not just get mired in navigating complex regulations, which add to the uncertainty. And there's a need to look at the entire ecosystem to collaborate, whether it's from industry, from academia, from institutions, from development agencies, and above all, money to do all this, and to pursue and to take big risks in the pursuit of discovery. And from my side, I've especially seen it firsthand, at Dr. Reddy's, because Dr. Reddy himself, way back when he started private sector discovery in 1992, he borrowed to invest in discovery initially. 14%. At that point of time, when he borrowed, the interest rates were pretty high. Sorry, at that point of time, it was pretty high in terms of the interest rates, almost 20% at the time. And even when we raised equity, when we proceeded to move on with it, it reached a time when the whole discovery played out, the risks played out, and then in fact in the chapter that Dr. Reddy wrote, he even had a full chapter on it, which was called the graveyard of the glitazars. It was almost unviable at one point of time, spending almost 14% of our sales on R&D, but we still kept going at it. And even at this point of time, we have tasted some success, but it's still is part of a journey in terms of what we do. Similarly, if you look at startups, from the perspective of startups, the support that they need through the entire life cycle of innovation, not just the beginning part. They also, if I see it from the other side, they also require incentives to continue to keep going at it, and also to take risks and not deal with uncertainty along the way. And if I see it from a policy level, from the government side, a lot of fiscal incentives that are needed to encourage innovation, for example, tax incentives for the industry, or direct funding itself by the government to support, especially infrastructure on the innovation hubs, policy support, and also to increase the scale of innovation, even through private partnership, or also if we see external funding, example from the VCs, from the private equity players, all this to build an ecosystem so that it attracts investments. I mean, I would just, to conclude my context setting, I would say that, IT industry, because of the incentives which the government gave, whether it was software parks, tax breaks, or whether it was ease in equity financing, IT industry grew tremendously. And that's a lesson that we can learn from. And also to, just to get perspectives, because now come back to the panelists to look at it from various perspectives, from the government side to financial institutions, from all angles. I would now invite opening comments from each of our panelists. I would request them to share their thoughts on one, what would be the opportunities from where we are at this point of time, that can contribute to an increase in funding for R&D and innovation, and also from their point of view, how do they see the current challenges? So if I can just invite Deepak, Mr. Deepak Bagla, to start off.
Satish, good to see you. And hi to everyone, morning, evening, depending upon whichever time zones we are in. But Satish, I must first start by complimenting you and your team. You were the original guys who actually took on R&D in a big way. And I remember in my previous life, which was as an investment banker, that is something we always used to be looking at high valuations where you guys were concerned. But very quickly, coming back to the point which you brought about. First, let me give you a statistic. In the past 60 months, actually, if I add 10 more months, let me add it. In the past 70 months, we've opened over 1,000 R&D centers in India of global multinationals. Today, India is the #1 R&D destination for global multinationals having their R&D centers outside of their head office. Typically, if you look at it in the original construct, R&D always used to be attached to the head office, but typically, now that you're expanding. So that's the first point which I do want to bring about. And it is across sectors. I mean, I would say that pharmaceutical, healthcare, life sciences definitely is right up there. It's one of the top sectors there, but that is a movement which has already begun. And I'm sure there are reasons about it. There's an ecosystem, you have trained manpower, skilled manpower, which is required for it. And I also believe when I speak to a number of these investors, and let me just introduce myself a little to each one of you. The reason why I'm telling you these statistics is because as I work for Invest India, which is the National Investment Promotion and Facilitation Agency of the government. And effectively, we are the first point of contact for an investor when they're looking to be in India. So this is the statistics which I get from our daily working. And I'm seeing these numbers expand exponentially. In fact, even during the pandemic, when we've had the worst unprecedented lockdown, the number of requests which we are working on to open R&D centers or to facilitate them for global corporations has gone up. Now, let me just very briefly, Satish, you want me to end here? And this just as an opening comment, and then we can take it later.
Sure, we can come back to you because I'll come back to you, Deepak, to get more into the details after this.
Because if you let me go, I'll go on for the next hours, which is not going to be very fair. Thank you, Satish.
No
let
problem.
me take it back.
Sure. Thanks, Deepak, for those starting comments. I now go on to Sanjay Murdeshwar from Novartis. Sanjay, over to you.
First of all, again, thank you so much for having me here, Satish, and all of the fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll make just a couple of facts, which again, just trying to understand more about the science behind discovery. There are 10,000 known diseases, but only 500 diseases actually have treatment, very strangely. There are 20,000 genes in the human body, but only around, I think, 60% or so have transcriptome is non-coding RNA. And there are 20,000 known proteins, but only 3% targeted by drugs today. So I think we can all agree that if opportunity is what funding is required to conduct research, then I think that's certainly huge. So the question which therefore I would like to propose, I think from an opportunity perspective is really about which part of the entire journey of discovery or research or development that we in India can be very good at which we have specific opportunities that we can bet very specific areas. So there are three opportunities, if I may just quickly just say that, and then we can go into debates later. I think number one opportunity that we have, I believe, is our skills in data and digital to serve research and discovery. Because we'll all agree is that research is now no more about pipettes and labs and test tubes. It's really becoming more of a computing challenge. And since it's a computing challenge now, one of the big strengths we have in India is our understanding of data analysis, computer scientists who can offer not just hardware, but the software part of the research. And this is where I believe funding can be massively important and to some extent a function of known unknowns, and so relatively less risky to start off from. So a lot of computing that can be used. The second element is very simply shifting our investments and massive opportunity, again, building on India's strengths from classical research into chemistry, in which India is very strong, to building an adjacent area, which is technology platforms. Again, here, in addition to the funding for discovery and development of drug candidates, funding is needed for research on new technology platforms for validating targets and therapeutics. And I know a lot of venture capitalists and fellows here have taken huge amount of interest in companies developing these new platforms. I'll give some examples of that later when we debate more. And third, last but not the least, is the principal investors in drug development and the opportunity differs at every stage. And therefore, while basic discovery research is massively long-term and sometimes generational in discovery. So truly, only the government, with all of its institutes, whether it's the Institute of Statistics or Center of Cell and Biology, the IITs and AIMS, can really step up here, because I can't imagine any country in the world where basic fundamental discovery is not started by public institutions and government-funded institutions, and then of course followed by late-stage development, which is funded by pharmaceutical companies or venture capitalists. So I think those are the real three big opportunities which I feel we can really build on. And conversely, so Satish, I think the research and the opportunities are also the challenge, and how do we navigate through this process? Stop.
Great. Thanks very much, Sanjay, for the insights from a multinational industry perspective. Especially when you said that there are three different areas: digital, the skills that already exist in India, especially chemistry, and the platforms that we already have. If I can move on to Shashank from Apax, again, this is just opening comments, just to reflect on what could be the opportunities, especially looking at it from different perspectives. We heard from the government, Deepak, and we've heard just now from Sanjay from an industry, but also if you see it from more like from a private equity, right? Would like to hear from you. So from your side, where do you see the opportunities and current challenges, and probably we'll move on to solutions after that.
Sure.
Shashank.
Thank you, Satish, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for having me on this panel. I want to start, Satish, with a description of what one of our companies in the medtech space, medical consumables, medical devices space, called Healthier Medtech, is doing right now. And this is a company based in India, manufacturing almost entirely in India, and make for the world, really. Make in India, serve the world. And so Healthier MedTech has 22 patents in India, 12 in the US, and has filed another 30 patents across India, US, and Europe, right? And a few years ago, this was a tiny company in the medtech space, competing with the giants, multinational giants, Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, very familiar names. And yet this is at quite a small scale, the type of innovation R&D that we have been able to do with this company. I should say the management really has done, and the scientists in the company and so on. So it's not as if, and Deepak sort of talked about some of this, that look, we are already, India is a location for a lot of R&D for global companies in India. I would argue actually there's fundamental work going on in India as well, right? But having said that, that's just one example. Having said that, I want to pick up on a word you use, Satish, and it's been used kind of throughout the day, which is really ecosystem. And Sanjay also sort of referred to that. Now, I would say, look, if you, exactly as Sanjay said, if you want to take a long-term view to how do you drive fundamental research through R&D, which, if you have that base, and it's almost like a virtuous circle, right? Or cycle. The more you do, the more it begets. And there are classic examples for this. There's Silicon Valley on the tech side. There's the Boston sort of ecosystem or cluster in biotech. There's Silicon Fen and that area around Cambridge in the UK. It needs that entire ecosystem to work together. I represent one small piece of that ecosystem, which is late stage funding. Prem is there for early stage funding, but it needs the university systems to work. It needs government funding because, as Sanjay said, fundamental research doesn't have the ROI or the payback period that a commercial organization would fund. It needs to be research done for research's sake, right? And so that is why you find that a lot of this innovation originally came out of great universities around the world. But even within those universities, the funding for a lot of those programs came from the government. And so we kind of have to almost look at it from a systems-wide thinking and ecosystem thinking. Who are the players? We need government to play. We need universities and educational institutions to play. We need early stage funding to play. We need entrepreneurs to play. We need late stage companies, yours and Ramesh's, and actually Sanjay's to play. We need later stage funding like ourselves to play. We need an equity market also, which is able to give exits to play. All of this it's almost system-wide thinking, and you can't attack any one piece of it in isolation. You have to think of it together. So let me stop there, but that's kind of how I think about the problem, right? It's that old story of, 4 blind men in a room with an elephant, and each of them was feeling a different part of the elephant and describing the tusk, the tail, the trunk, the legs. But you need someone with a picture of the whole elephant to sort of tell you, look, this is it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you on that, Sanjay, because even in the initial conversations that we had while forming the recommendations for the committee, you were stressing on this ecosystem, saying that it's not just because the question then was, why won't you invest, and take bigger risks? And then you were pointing out saying that it's just not you, it's the whole ecosystem, unless that whole thing develops in its entirety, all the way, encouraging everyone to take those risks. It can't just be one person doing it, right? So that's something. So I think it's a good segue to also move on to Prem now. From your point of view, how do you see it? Especially the late stage funding that you really put your money, and then where do you see the missing gaps and things like that, and the challenges, if I put it that way.
Prem? Yeah. Good evening, Satish. Thank you for having me here, and of course, thanks to the IPA and Sudarshan Jay and Shirish Belapure for having me here. It's going to be hard to match this panel in terms of providing insights, but I'll make an attempt. So I guess just as context, I represent 8 Roads Ventures, which is the proprietary investment arm for Fidelity in India. And we have over a dozen people that are completely focused on life sciences and healthcare investing across the spectrum. But as Shashank said, more at the early to mid growth level stages. And beyond a personal aspiration, of course, there is a selfish professional interest in seeing the innovation ecosystem on the life sciences and healthcare front develop in the country. And as I look at it, I think that what we need, and some of the panelists have spoken about this earlier, I think you need a concerted focus across stakeholders to build what I think is an innovation eco-centric or an innovation-centric ecosystem. And if I were to put a timeline to it, I said, look, if we can achieve it over the next decade, I think that will be excellent. We've seen China move up that curve. We've seen Israel do it really well. We see high-level medical device innovation coming out of Israel. And even as Shashank said, if you look at the Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts areas, 10, 12 years ago, Kendall Square, right, which is the T stop outside of MIT, would be a desolate place, right? But But in the last decade, that has transformed into a bustling Silicon Valley equivalent for life sciences. And I think in my mind, the starting point needs to be to emphasize building the foundations for such an ecosystem. In my mind, one, you need a funnel for innovation. I think coming from the industry, two, coming from academia, but also, you know, through programs which might be like an A star in Singapore, being able to translate that to a commercial, product or a commercial application. Number two, you need IP protection, right, and safeguarding. Number three, you need the driving of a talent pool that is best in class, that can coexist, that can brainstorm ideas, whether that happens, through innovation hubs, where people are coming together and making mistakes, I guess, together and innovating together. And fourth, I think, as you said it, Satish, I think support from the government. And in my mind, I think more in the form of grants and subsidies that drive scale up, so that all of that becomes a virtuous cycle. If I contrast that with the challenges that I see getting there, I think all of these are doable in my mind. It's a matter of when and not if. If I see the challenges in my mind, there are two big ones. One is, how do we make being an innovator an attractive career option today in the life sciences and healthcare field, which is rewarding you both financially, beyond just your passions. I think being passionate is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And if you look at NCL in Pune, where Dr. Prem has done an excellent job spawning a innovation hub, you see very passionate entrepreneurs doing it a lot more, just to be an entrepreneur than financial rewards in this life sciences innovation sector. And number two, you need a market, a domestic market that rewards this innovation. So we need to create some success stories, even if it is 5, 6 success stories that will then feed off each other, and create a lot more. So I'll stop there, Satish, unless you have questions.
Sure. Thanks, Prem. I do have questions. I will come back to it, subsequently after hearing more from Ramesh and Matthias also. But I think great points, especially on the challenges. Just to look at it from the overall, point of view, especially if you see it from an innovator, right? So where is he going at it, from his perspective, and also this, the point that you said that you need a funnel, of opportunities, right, of enough things out there, to invest in. And all those also, needing a market, especially if they need to get the reward. So important points. I'll come back on that. Moving on to you, Ramesh, again from an industry perspective. I've just briefly talked about our experience in terms of what happened as part of a journey, but more especially looking at the current situation, because the things like whatever the policymakers spoke about in the earlier sessions, that there is this research and investment linked scheme coming in, that they're talking about various other areas, but more from a purely company's point of view, right? Especially looking at the risks that we all face, especially when we are want to invest, right? So and then looking at all those areas, obviously there are more opportunities in terms of what the government could address in terms of probably good tax breaks and things like that. But what else do you see, from company's point of view, on what, say, you would request, say, Deepak at this point of time to also say, from the government, we need this, right? So what else do you think we should look at this?
Really, Satish, thank you very much for having me on. In your speech, you spoke about the fact that the risk associated with innovation is pretty high. And as you would recognize, to bring a molecule to market, it generally takes about $1 billion. Not to speak of just the risk. It's binary. Either you have a product or you don't have a product. You also spoke about the fact that the entire ecosystem has to kind of rise to get us to that stage. And we seem to be really far away from that. The Indian companies are, small in terms of, overall size and still evolving. So to the extent they just do not have the deep pockets to carry on with that. And unless there is tremendous amount of support from the government, it is going to be pretty difficult. And the government support could take various forms, including incentives and the like. This just because of the fact that the rest of the world really seems to have got their act right when it comes to that. When you speak about America, the kind of government support, We're talking about at least 35% when it comes to drug development. In China, it's close to about 40%. The quantum of funds available between $30 to $35 billion when it comes to America, $40 billion when it comes to China and the like, and a host of other things as well. So I think from our perspective, I think incentivizing incentives by the government, in terms of tax reduction would be an imperative. We had the super deduction of 200% on R&D some time ago. It was brought down to 150%. That's Section 35(2)(ab) for you. But since March 2020, we don't have that. But whilst if we talk about the other countries, USA, Japan, China, they are incentivizing R&D, but we seem to have regressed. Some of these, tax laws that we have, in fact, puzzles me really. We have, in fact, a patent box regime, which is there in other parts of the globe. But if you actually have that, and if this seems to be exemptions for, in fact, income coming in from India, but when it comes to global patents, etc., it seems to be, we're not in a position to kind of exploit it because that is not available for us. I could talk about a host of other, measures that the government could do to actually, to take us to a different level. I could also talk about the fact that, the accounting nuances between IFRS and FASB seem to be working against us. And if you talk about US-based firms, they are an advantage because FASB is more rule-based accounting, whilst and exemptions there for certain industries. But you speak about Indian companies, we follow Ind AS, which is based on IFRS, and there's more principle-based accounting. Under FASB, for example, if a financial investor is willing to take R&D risk, then it is off the books of the pharma company. Of course, it is at a higher cost of funding. IFRS would still require this to be recorded as a liability in the books of the pharma company. Thus, there is more pressure on IFRS, based companies based in India at least. There are a lot of things that we can do when it comes to, in fact, return on investment for innovation, and a lot more that can be done when it comes to innovative funding itself. But I'll wait for a later opportunity to speak about all of that.
Sure. Thanks, Ramesh. Moving on to Matthias for your comments. Your colleague Jake Henry earlier in the session, talked about if the opportunities were to be used at this point of time from just being a pharmacy to the world, India when it went about from APIs to generics to various spaces in the pharmaceutical chain, in different parts of the value chain. How do you see the opportunities from your side if you have to move to the next stage, innovate in India? And then, it's like to really be out there as one of the top competitors there. So how do you really see this moving forward, Matthias?
Satish, thank you very much. And I mean, it's a real honor to be here with you, with everyone, and serving the purpose of, actually pushing India to get more into the innovative space. So it's a very tough question. Let me try a little bit to start this discussion. And I mean, with my esteemed colleagues here, it's not so easy to add now, but let me try and answer along three themes. The one would be, it is actually a unique time. And I heard that a little bit, but I really want to emphasize that for funding biomedical innovation, and that's actually perhaps also to raise awareness, to raise interest, I mean, which you all need to make these changes. Secondly, it's intrinsically difficult, and anyone else saying so that would be almost foolish. So let's acknowledge a little bit the difficulty. But I would also say there are very clear recipes emerging. I heard already China, I heard the US, etc. I won't belabor the point, just maybe one or two quick examples. So very quickly to back up these 3 points. Why is it unique? We see a real confluence of progress in bioscience with computation, data, automation, and Sanjay touched on it a little bit. This has actually fundamental innovation potential. I mean, we call it the biorevolution. We have published on it. There's research available on it. But it makes the point that now's the time to reap the fruit of that progress. I mean, we estimate 2 to 4 trillion economic potential over the next 20 years. It's just to raise the bar also. This is not about, could we also have this one more product? It's actually a real innovation opportunity. Now, why is it difficult? And I mean, I really liked Satish, how you started this panel, because typically there's enough money available. It's not that we can't find money. It's this very careful orchestration of science, of talent, and of money. Some of you have used the word ecosystem, but that orchestration is difficult. And if I say now, there are a couple of recipes emerging. Let me very quickly. One, I would look at China. China in 2016, the Apax, that a group of pharmaceutical associations sat together, had a discussion almost like us, and it was very much a top-down systems approach. What player does play what role? How does the regulatory environment help us? How are trials easier? The tech side, the IP side, etc. Exactly as we said, but there's a system view. It's not like saying, how do we get more money? It was a systems approach, and we have seen quite some progress over the last 5 years. Secondly, boosting venture capital, because venture capital has an important role to play here. And there's also lots of efforts in Europe to boost that class, because Europe is also struggling a little bit, because funding is not a one-time event, it's longitudinal. And the early stages work well in Europe, the mid stages not so well. Everybody's moving to the US, and happy to talk more about it. And again, I would come to capital finds the talent, and it's not the other way around. So what could really India stand for? And that I heard that also. What's the sweet spot? I mean, I strongly believe in the capabilities, also this combination with computing. There is a sweet spot, but it needs to have credibility, both from the academic side and maybe with a marquee investor. And my last closing is maybe to bring a little bit optimism. I mean, locations get on the map very quickly. Over 5 years, we have seen that. I mean, let's think about this. Boston, Cambridge, we talk about, and maybe I take the 30-year time frame, but in the 80s, it was all in Europe. And now look where we are. So maybe a little bit optimism at the end, but let me stop here and see where we go in the discussion.
Absolutely. Certainly, there's a great amount of potential in terms of, where we started with, as far as the country is concerned on innovation, where companies went into this. And if you see the point where we have come to it, that the point of inflection point was used quite a bit by various policymakers today, saying that we are in a good position. Right? There are certain elements which are there, but important thing I'm hearing from all panelists is, it's like it all needs to come together. It can't just be one piece of it. It has to be orchestrated well. The different parts of the ecosystem need to be strengthened. And moving forward, there's plenty that can be achieved. So again, if I can go back to Deepak, Deepak, in the beginning, you certainly painted out the opportunities. But if I again were to see it from a point of view of the government, right, especially from a point which is about direct support, right? It can be the direct budget support. It can be, from the already existing schemes which are present either through BIRAC or, through the various organizations which are there. What could be those 3-4 things maybe that you would say that if unshackled, right, or if there's a policy which can give a boost to all these things, what would those 3-4 things be, and what can the government be willing to do?
So let me start, Satish, by saying, this is a stated objective of the government. They do want to see, and it's not just in isolation that the government has come up with this focus, but there's been a lot of stakeholder feedback on that one. And we are seeing results of it, where we do want to see India right up there where R&D is concerned. And that's where we're already beginning to see a momentum happening. One of the very interesting words you used was orchestrated. Joining the dots is very critical in this field. And I don't know if Professor Raghavan mentioned it, but one of the things which Professor Raghavan's team is doing is a special program called AGNI, AGNII, the Accelerated Growth of New India Innovation. In fact, it's the Invest India team which is executing it, and that's why I want to speak about it. What they are doing there is tying the dots between the stakeholders, between academia, business, government, the R&D center, and also doing a fast track of taking innovation to commercialization. But another interesting element which is happening within the AGNI program is how they're trying to tie the dots and join people within the same silos or within the same verticals, not silos. One of the things which we've realized, and more so in the R&D center, R&D across the globe, actually, it's not just an Indian phenomenon, they tend to work in silos. The ability to trust somebody else is not at the highest of levels. And there is a lot of duplication which is happening across. And frankly, in many ways, you could see that funding could be better utilized if you could all bring them together. It could also speed up the outcomes. So essentially what I've also heard in some of the meetings is that now we've got to start focusing on research with some outcomes and hopefully with some timelines attached to it. So I'm leaving innovation out of it, Satish, yet. Okay, I'm not coming to innovation because I think that entire piece on the startup side has done exceptionally well. Now talking about capital, it does require deep pocket patient capital. There's no doubt about it. I mean, especially the kind of research which we are discussing today. The interesting thing is there are pockets of capital available within the system. In fact, one of the statistics there, and I'm wanting to see how, I mean, the government's effort is how we can broad-base this. 90% of the funding for R&D is just going to about 10% of the academic institutions. That's so academia. Why don't you broad-base that? You have a larger number of academic institutions which are now coming into play. And the interesting element there is, and this is where I draw a parallel with what happened on our startup scheme. You see, the interesting thing, by the way, I must tell you, it's one of a fascinating business school case study of how astute policy, which is based on a lot of stakeholder consultation, and very good outcome-based execution can give you a result that within, when was Startup India launched? January 16, 2016? So we're just about 60 months away from that. In 60 months, India today is number 3 in the world in number of unicorns, number 2 in the world in number of startups, and number 1 in the world in new startups adding every day. But I'll tell you what I'm coming to. What I'm coming to is very interesting. Today, out of the 739 odd districts of India, I have a registered startup in over 700 districts. Now I'm coming back to innovation and to a point on that one. And sorry, I'm digressing a bit. But the point which I'm bringing there is that each of these is working on areas which need not have been areas which are worked on in a typical metro, larger city setting issues, challenges. And that is broad basing the kind of problems and solutions which are being created. And at each of those levels, there's very interesting level of funding, from creating prototypes to providing equity, to providing debt, and also to providing market access or to government procurement. So if I look at that startup learning process where they've been able to bring about incentives and including capital at each stage of that entire chain, now that needs to be seen how to bring it down into where R&D in deep science is concerned, let's say, in many ways. And yes, what I have seen is that we are not seeing, for example, we have a fund of funds for startup. We've got about $2 billion, and I used to be on the investment committee on that one. The number of VCs coming into us, we hardly had anybody who was looking to be funding deep science or R&D. VCs have a shorter time frame. And, so those pools of capital are there. But after having said that, I must say, there is decent amount of capital which is lying in pools, both with the state governments, with the central government. But it can't be done by the government alone. It has to be a joint effort. And the fact does remain, and it could be to a point where maybe we do not have very large size companies, but how many companies in India are there which are spending 3 or 4 or 5% on R&D? And that is also a core business of business. So looking at it even from that perspective, we can all say that yes, an ecosystem needs to be created. And I'm seeing, and hopefully with these kind of discussions and the kind of things which are happening now, and a focused discussion on this one, hopefully we will see that percentage grow up. But yes, as a final point, I would want to say that joining the dots is something where there's better utilization of resources, which is happening. There's a fast tracking of more capital coming into it. And there's also greater outcomes coming out of it. And that is what is now the primary focus where the government is concerned, and a number of activities which we are doing. Back to you, Satish.
Thanks, Deepak. I think you do make the important point from a government thinking at this point of time, especially the fact that one is we need to join the dots clearly, and this is an attempt, right? So in terms of this whole R&D committee recommendations given to the policymakers putting out the draft R&D policy, the dialogues like this, because there will still be unanswered questions, unfinished business, if I may put it that way, which still needs to be done. But before I go back to the VC, private equity, I also wanted to get a view from Sanjay. Novartis, if you see, in the past, you have moved your, not moved, I would say, you expanded your R&D centers to China. If I recollect, almost there was a $200 million investment at one point of time. And then obviously at that point of time, India was not the rightful place for a multinational because of the IP issues. But for a moment, if I keep the IP issues aside, because it's just one contentious issue which is still, to be resolved from your point of view. But even outside of that, what else would you think would limit your company's, say, thinking, from investing into India? Because we are again talking about pieces of the puzzle, and then now you've heard, lots of commitment happening. What would you say maybe those 2-3 things which would, actually encourage you to say that, yes, this India is the place to invest when it comes to R&D for innovation?
Right. No, thanks so much, Satish. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Shashank talked about it. I think the first element, I think for what it is worth, it is talent. I think, as I just wanted to make that point a little more. We are very good at chemistry, but research of the future is in biology and in biochemistry. And therefore, what is the type of talent that we have in India that can really do the work? I'm sure all of the VCs would agree with me. Of course, investments and great technology is important, but really the talent and the caliber of the people really is important. I think it was an IPA study, if I'm not mistaken, which I remember reading somewhere, that in India, we just have, I think, around 1,500 PhDs of biochemistry. And in the US, there are 15,000 PhDs of biochemistry graduating every year. Now, that's not possible for a country of our size and the talent pool that we have, that we go towards the right areas of research. So I think number one, I think has to be the talent. Number two, I think would be, to some extent, understanding what we can absolutely make, why we should invest in India and what are the big strengths that India brings us. And the big strengths that India brings us is I mentioned it earlier, is the massive amount of work, the massive amount of talent we have in the data digital computing area. We would like to, and as I said, research is becoming, or discovery is becoming, a computing challenge now. And therefore, if we can have, again, very great policies to ensure that we can continuously focus on drug regulatory system changes, or strengthen the clinical trial institution, or optimize basic research on innovative science, technology by promoting technological achievements, or improving legislation for compensation, and so on and so forth. I think if we all of these put together, then we can really use the talent that we have in India for computing far more. We have, as you know, already invested nearly 2,500 of these talents already in Hyderabad, and we are attracting, and we're doing a lot of work for global clinical development, but not so much work in basic discovery and research, where it's really about data pools and how do we do the work there. And last but not the least, I think it has the investments in research. If I'm not mistaken, it was mentioned by you, Prem. There is a return that is required at the end of the day. And if the return is lucrative, then everybody is going to invest. And I think, if I may be a contrarian and talk about it, the reason people invest in the US is because it's a $150 billion pharmaceutical market. Why people invest in China is going to become a $100 billion pharmaceutical market, and innovation is paid for. And therefore, if we know where the innovation is, where the markets are, I think to some extent, usually investments follow research, and then it really is a snowball effect from there on. So I think if the opportunity is there, then the returns will always come, and everything flows.
Certainly. Thanks, Sanjay. It will take time. all these are multi-year efforts. Especially when you say talent, there's a certain talent available, which we're happy with. But I think the innovation that is required for the future requires a different kind of a talent. A lot of it has to be, the seen in our academic institutions. A lot of it has to come from overseas.
Sure.
If you're able to attract talent from abroad, certainly agree on that point. Maybe I'll just shift back to the VCs and the private equity players. Starting with you, Shashank, again. You heard Deepak say that there are things that the government can do, and it is willing to do. And also, we heard in, I think, one of the sessions earlier that example was given. I think again it was Jake Henry from McKinsey. He also talked about Israel as an example, where I think to encourage, or maybe I think it was China to a certain extent, that there was a joint effort, right? There was a certain funding which came from the government, and then the VCs also, had a pull into this, and then that spurred some kind of funding startups and things like that. So if I were to talk about, say, gaps in India, and then from a VC point of view, private equity point of view, where do you see things can change, and what would you suggest?
It's a great question, Satish, and I'll give you what I'd call a conventional answer, and I'll give you a little bit of an unconventional answer, actually building on what Sanjay and Prem have talked about. I'd say the conventional answer is, look, the government already has, Deepak alluded to the pools of capital that are there. The government already has some programs, BIRAC being an example. And in fact, one of the companies that Healthium recently acquired is a beneficiary of BIRAC funding, and that has been very, very helpful for fundamental research and an innovative product in bandages, in antimicrobial bandages that they brought out. So the conventional answer is, look, whether it is in India or in China or in the US, government funding alongside commercial or VC funding that's searching for returns. Singapore is very good at it as well, where the government funds these hubs. I think that would be very helpful, right? And the government does it to some extent, but it can do a lot more. Identify experts, very focused, focus them also on regional hubs, because as we know, these ecosystems develop around certain places, and there's a reason why ecosystems build on each other. That's the conventional answer. And then, Ramesh also referred to tax and other areas, and frankly, there's work to be done on tax. There's work to be done on allowability of incentives, tax incentives, carry forwards. There's work to be done on IP rules, and there was an IP regime that was perhaps more fit for purpose for a generic era, versus if we are now moving to an innovation, we need to kind of evolve that a little bit. So all of that is there, but to my mind, those are solvable problems. I think the softer aspect of this, and again, Deepak alluded to it, to say, look, it took a concerted effort, it took some years of effort, but once you started to get those success stories, the types that Prem referred to, one unicorn led to the next and the third and so on, VCs piled in, and it's led to an acceleration in that. We very much need that on the innovation and healthcare innovation side, life sciences innovation. And Sanjay gave an interesting statistic that there's 15,000 biomedical PhDs in the US and only 1,500 in India, and look at the discrepancy in scale. I don't know the answer to it. I'd ask the further question, of those 15,000, how many of them are actually Indian? And, I would guess a very high proportion, right, in the US, which means they grew up here. They did their schooling here. They did probably their first degree here, but then decided, look, there really isn't any great graduate institution of high quality, or where I can write great peer-reviewed papers, or that will give me funding for my program, or if I want to commercialize some of my innovation and research, that I will have that large payoff, the type that Prem talked about, right? But there's lots of those success stories in America, right? So let me just pack my bags, go to America, and America, for the most part, has been very welcoming of that kind of person and human capital. And I think we need to reverse that. we need to make it, to plagiarize a little bit what Prem said. It's worth their while. Sorry, I don't know where you lost me. What I was saying was, it is really important to make the prize big enough for someone, that they want to come back, that the success stories are here, that they're ringing the bell on the stock exchange, right? And they're on the front pages of the Economic Times. The reason why, people don't always do everything for money. There are other reasons. They want to be a success. They want to be viewed as a success. They want to become a role model. And I think all of those are something that we should focus on. Back to the point I made on system-wide thinking.
Sure. Great. That's good points made, Shashank, especially looking at the overall picture, that there are certainly things that can be done. Prem, you want to add on to that, especially if I were to also talk about some of the things that Shashank also mentioned, some of the tax issues and all that, but more from a regulatory part of it, not regulatory, in terms of pathway of products approval and things like that. I'm not talking about that. It's more from the companies that you invest in, and also if more foreign capital were to come in, what are the problems that you face, or hurdles you face from the regulatory side, in your area, and then what can be done about it?
Yeah, look, I think the problem transcends just the regulatory aspect. I think as VC investors, as we evaluate, some of these innovative biopharmaceutical and medical device companies, and I wish there were more that we could evaluate than the number we see today. I think the mantra for us is very simple. I think number one, we want to see a large market. Number two, we want to see talent. And number three, we should be able to exit at some point. And when I think about the market, which is where the regulatory aspect plays a role, I think it is okay to have an innovation landscape that is dependent on a Western market, as as Sanjay said, for commercialization. But it is better if there is also a domestic market that is large enough for these companies to be able to commercialize their products. And that will, in my mind, catalyze the innovation ecosystem. We've seen that, in China, as Sanjay said, and of course, we've seen that in the US. And the two enablers for that, one is a faster path to market on the regulatory side. I think, you're now beginning to see clarity on medical device innovation and separating it out from pharma products. But until a couple of years ago, there was the same pathway for both devices as well as for drugs. We have we invested beyond the 20 that we have. One of our investments is in a cellular therapy company, right, for cancer, called Immunil. And that company is, of course, going through the regulatory pathway for its products. And the regulators are getting educated about the pathway, right? And I think that only lengthens the time, and time is opportunity cost for us, for the company, and things like that. And it's often the first or second company that has to educate the regulators before the third one is able to leverage all of the learnings to get a faster path to market. So how do you get a faster path to market? Number two, once you get to the market, what happens, right? How do you make sure that there is a reward for the innovation that happens? What would be very helpful to see is, look, can the government partner on procurement? Can the government partner to, split, the cost of the drug? Because that price times volume equation needs to work, Satish, for innovation to be profitable. And if the price is not going to be the China price or the US price, then at least the volume needs to work. And the government, I think, can play a very seminal role in driving that. So that's one. The second, I think, in my mind, that is important and also encompasses the regulatory aspect, is the talent part that both Sanjay and Shashank talked about. And of course, we have great wet chemistry talent, right? And I think biology talent is also growing. I've been doing this now for 14 years in the same segment. And, if I look at biology talent 14 years ago to now, I think we are in a very different place. It has grown, I think, thanks to biosimilar development. You and other companies have done it. Interesting biologics, vaccines, etc. So biology is growing, but then you don't see enough high quality clinical development talent. You don't see enough high quality regulatory talent in terms of in terms of driving the introduction of new products to the market, being able to interface with the US FDA and say, look, this is what's required, this is not what's required. How do I lay out my clinical development plan, my clinical trial, interface with the Indian regulators? So all of that talent needs to be best in class, right? And there, if I look at China, and with all of its controversy, the one program that I thought was quite critical in driving talent back from the US to China was the 1,000 Talents program, right? Where the government basically chose several hundred people, including, interestingly, a couple of our colleagues from our who were asked to come back and who were asked to move to the government. They were given money, they were given resources, but that has really catalyzed, the whole innovation ecosystem in China. And so talent, in my mind, from a regulatory perspective, is also very important. And the third thing that's important is, our ability to exit, right? Of course, the seed stage investor needs a Series A investor. The Series A investor needs a Series B investor. But finally, you need, and ironically, now in the US, and we are prolific investors in the drug discovery landscape in the US under a separate brand. But now in the US, seed rounds itself are becoming $100, $200 million rounds because the capital markets are so evolved that you raise the $100, $200 million seed round, and then 3 years later, the company goes public, even with early stage programs. So you need a capital markets mechanism that is able to support and reward innovative companies, right? So you need people to appreciate, pre-revenue companies, appreciate R&D. You need an analyst community that can understand pre-revenue companies, that can understand the value of IP and things like that. So in my mind, it transcends beyond just a regulatory problem, I think, to solving these three pillars as I see it. Sorry, long-winded answer to your question, Satish.
No problem. Pretty important, Prem, especially looking at examples, of say, for example, you talked about China, how things have happened there. So maybe I will just take that question to Matthias, from a aspect of saying China also was in a situation where they did not have this innovation, right? So they started much, much later. In fact, India has started this journey much earlier. Several companies got into this. Lupin, Dr. Reddy's, Glenmark, Zydus, whole host of companies got into this much earlier. But then China started late. And then, for various things, 1,000 Talents, which Prem talked about when it came to talent, or when it came to VCs, the support given by the government. What other things would you say that China did very well? But here again, it's not to compare that similar things would apply to India. But then, if you were to look at India and then say from the discussion that we've heard so far, what additional things that India could do, learning from experience? It could be China, it could be other countries which have embarked on being successful on this path of innovation. What lessons could be learned from that? Matthias?
Thank you, Satish. Let me try to start with China, but raise a few examples. I really like this theme and Prem, that you brought up the 1,000 talents, because I have now had the honor to see quite some discovery labs at the East Coast, West Coast, in the US. And frankly, there are many Indian talents. First generation, sometimes second generation. And so I do wonder, is that actually either the access, some kind of collaboration with the US, or frankly, what's the India talent program? Because there's ton of super talented people. So, Satish, to stay in the question, I think that made a big difference. And I would say functional capabilities, as just came up, regulatory, but frankly also entrepreneurial. So what we also, I mean, we have sometimes a challenge in Europe. We have great scientists, but not necessarily great bio-entrepreneurs. That comes as they grow these companies, as they make the step out of academia. But talent, that talent program was a big one. My second one is, and I'm hopeful that such a discussion like today can make a difference, because I really go back to 2016, where the R&D heads across China came together, multinational, locals, etc., and basically said, and it started similar to your comments, what is the system design? A big impediment was the regulatory system. So how do we accelerate trial timelines? How do we get clearer in terms of how to run trials, etc.? And that became a big attractor. Now, I'm not saying that trials necessarily is identical and needs to be the attractor for India, but almost this logic, as we discussed today, through the hurdles. And there were, I mean, you can even look, I mean, there are a lot of public white papers who said through the system design, they touched on tax as well, but I think a lot was on regulatory trial timelines and that talent program. I would raise another example on funding. I mean, and that's the Innovative Medicines Initiative out of Europe, IMI. So Europe in mid-2000, so it started 2013, was actually in a phase where there was a real recommitment to drug innovation. Not yet this where we are now, that what I call the biorevolution. But what they set up is the largest private-public collaboration across the world. And the initial wave, 2013 to 18, was a 2 billion effort, 1 billion from industry, 1 billion from public. And so, I mean, it's almost this idea, it was a matching. So how that worked is actually not peanut butter spreading. It was actually, let's make project proposals. Some projects actually could be semi-competitive, so multiple companies together. And I mean, those would be proposed, matching of funding, industry partly in kind, not always dollars to dollars. And that led to efforts like the lead screening factory, so real capabilities that brought the industry forward. So I would say that there are quite some interesting funding ideas, I would say. And then certainly I would say Israel was mentioned. Israel had a real strategy effort. UK had a real life science strategy effort. Singapore had a very focused effort. So what is actually the strategic focus? What's the path? I mean, be it starting on manufacturing backwards, a little bit how, I mean, from my perspective, some areas looked at. Some innovation forward, let's say UK with the golden triangle from really renowned universities forward, and then bringing in lead marquee investors like you see Cambridge in the UK together with AstraZeneca, also GSK. Or maybe I stop here, Satish. I mean, that touches almost talent, capital, and that public-private collaboration a little bit, these ideas.
Absolutely makes sense. That's good examples from other countries. Ramesh, if you can get back to you talked more about the fiscal part of it, right? So the tax breaks and it's like various other regulations and things like that. But if you were to see more on the non-fiscal side, right? So from an industry, from a company like yours, because I know you have this MALT1 inhibitor that you licensed out, and then in the other programs that you're working, if you were to do things differently, right? Again, where do you see the missing pieces? I mean, would you see it as, say, again, if I go back to Chinese example, there was also this an availability of the market, right? Reimbursement from the government for products registered in China, innovated products, for example. That could be one. Any such ideas come to your mind outside of just the purely fiscal ones?
Yeah, surely. So I won't revisit this entire framework of taxation around R&D. Of course, Shashank certainly said it is actually solvable. So we'll move on to other areas for sure. I spoke about accounting, but I think something which I think the government can really help on is essentially ROI for innovation. And Prem did bring that about. We did talk about, in fact, a pretty large market, but the fact of the matter is the per capita income in India is particularly low. So I would think patient assistance programs for diseases with India-specific burden, a lot of things could be diabetes to colorectal cancer and all of that. If the government could do something about that, it would be good. We could also talk about, in fact, direct subsidies to compensate for a lower price, 50% differential between India and others, so that exists, so potentially if you can have a direct subsidy scheme, perhaps, that could also be addressed. Prem also spoke about, other things, and I think my other co-panelists were talking about public-private partnerships and the like. From an industry perspective, I think one should also look at other innovative ways of funding. And to my mind, what really appeals is, in fact, crowdfunding itself. And there are several ways of going about it. It could have donation-based crowdfunding, and people might simply invest because they believe in a particular cause. Donors have social or personal motivation for putting the money and expecting nothing back. If there is a system of an ecosystem which is being spawned off in this area, perhaps it would be a good thing to talk about. I could also talk about debt crowd funding in a P2P lending, so to speak. Investors receive money, the money back usually with interest, although there may be some projects in developing countries where no interest is paid at all. P2P lending is an alternative to seeking a loan from a bank. In that sense, it is slightly different. It gives some return to the investors as they can choose who they fund it. And there's also a feel-good factor for the investor from funding what they really things that they really believe in. Third, I would also talk about equity crowdfunding. In line with debt funding, people can invest in things that they believe in, so that they can exchange the money for shares or a small stake in the enterprise. So these things could potentially come. These are not developed in India as yet, but these are there in other parts of the globe. So one should look at that. One other thing which you have not asked me, but I would also comment about the education system in India, which I feel very strongly about. Indians, there's a lot of emphasis on rote learning, so to speak. So we have a lot of people who have good knowledge of chemistry, biology, and so on. But I think if the entire education system were to be realigned, if it was going to be reoriented, and it becomes a little more creative, then I think then you can marry a lot more skills rather than actually looking at siloed thinking. I think research is actually going to be a function of good chemical knowledge of chemistry, biology, and potentially something like electrical engineering. So if that were to be brought about, by changing and there's an education policy being brought in by the government, that could potentially help our cause. So there's a lot of things to be done. As you rightly pointed out, the entire ecosystem has to come together to make this a success. And hopefully this will all happen in the near future.
Thanks, Ramesh. Especially that part on crowdfunding that you talked about was an idea that they came from you, and then we put it as part of the report. So certainly helpful. Even the other parts that you talk about, including the one on education that you said. In fact, it's a whole big subject which probably will be discussed in the session. Some parts of it tomorrow in that industry academia linkages, because it will again come back to talent.
Yes.
Which is the most relevant thing. Whether you say it's like, why are not too many investments coming in from outside, whether it's from multinationals or from more of a VCs. The question of this talent is always there at the back of the mind, saying how far ahead are we in this area, and what more needs to be done in terms of interventions, from various sides.
True.
The institutions themselves changing the curriculum or various other things, but that's for a different group which will be debating it tomorrow. We're almost coming to the end of the session. So if there are any final comments or any other ideas that you want to talk about it, then we can just go back to the audience. I think they might also have some questions. Starting with Deepak, anything that you think we missed out?
Satish, just a comment. There was, let's agree that we are at the initial stages of this entire journey, where R&D is concerned in many ways. And as I see it, I think we are at a very interesting inflection point. The very fact that we are all getting together, getting all these points, getting learnings and best examples, and trying to see how we can incorporate that. And one part of that is, if you really look at it, there was mention about the IPR part of it, that we have redone that entire IPR legal process, as you know, and rewritten that. This was about 40 months ago. And that has been now fairly well acknowledged globally. And in addition to that, enforcement of IPR is where what the government is now focusing on, which is training right through all the agencies and stakeholders involved in this process. So I think that is where work needed to be done, which is happening as we speak. As I see, I think we are seeing very interesting nudging exercises and the momentum picking up quite fast. And the talent bit is a very critical one, but hopefully I am seeing more and more youngsters looking to come back to India. I see that happening in my own office. I mean, from some of the best schools across the globe, I see them back. And some of you have also been dealing with them. So I think that's also a good trend. And hopefully we'll see more of it. And please don't forget, We may be an ancient civilization, but we are still a very young nation. So we still have a long way to go. Thanks. Back to you, Satish.
Thanks, thanks, Deepak. I certainly did meet some of the people who are in your team. Very, very bright young people who have, chosen to take up careers from you. Great effort there. Sanjay, any comments you want to make? Final ones.
No, I think first of all, yeah, I agree. I think Mr. Bagla, you've got some really smart people. Yeah, we need to poach some of them. I'm just kidding. No, but I'm kidding. No, but I think just 2 points here. I think discovery is a long process and high risk. And I think we all accept it. And therefore, I think, and India has some very intrinsic talents right now, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And that's in the area of technology platforms, data, digital. I think we need to have 2 parallel tracks where we focus on the next 5-10 years, what we can immediately do and really build it up. Because that's really where discovery is going. And then, of course, we can always have the parallel track of long-term discovery, which honestly in every market is 30, 40, 50 years of fundamental ecosystem building. Hopefully we can do it 10, 15 years.
Great. Prem?
No, not much to add, Satish. Look, I think my aspiration is India gets there in a 10-year time frame. I think it's a target that is well within the country's reach. Of course, it will take effort and patience, but I feel very positive that we will get there. At the end of the day, from our perspective, we are paid to take 10-year views, especially in this sector where I think things always take longer and are always more expensive, as I joke to our pharma and med device entrepreneurs. So we remain very bullish. I think drug discovery, medical device innovation is very high on our list of funds. So yeah, I think we continue to remain very positive on that path.
Great to hear that, Prem, that you're positive and bullish on this area. And Shashank, from your side, final comments.
I'll just second what Prem said, Satish. I think we've talked a lot about the challenges and the to-dos on this call, but I think it's really within our grasp, right? It speaks to exactly the types of industries and businesses that India has proven itself very good at, whether it is IT services, whether it's generic pharma, and it's the same. Sanjay talked about data and analytics as an example. It's the same inputs. It's the brain power. It's the ingenuity. It's the entrepreneurship, which Matthias referred to. Less missing, perhaps a bit more in Europe, but present here in Spain. So I think the opportunity is really within our grasp. So it's very heartening to hear the discussion on this panel, and I think I feel very positive that this is a solvable problem for us in the next 5 or 10 years.
Great. Thanks for the optimism, Shashank. Matthias, over to you. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Matthias. I keep getting the doubt.
Perfect. No, very good. Thank you, Satish. I'm also more on India can make a big difference in 5 years. Of course, to realize everything will take longer. I would just leave with 2 thoughts. One is, I really believe in the convergence of technologies, this confluence. I believe that's rather good than bad for India, because it's a strength in various technologies, digital technology, we talked about it. And my second thought is, we talked a lot about talent, but just to be explicit, I'm not only talking about the people taking on sites, going into companies, but also the importance of academia. I would underline that in all important clusters, academia is super important. And that's maybe one example I throw in last second, which is actually how Canada ramped up in AI. That was a lot by importing high senior academics. So what's the program for India to also ramp up on the academic side or become even stronger? But really engaging discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Matthias. Any last word from you, Ramesh?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm not a punter, but having said that, I would bet on this. I would think that whilst we have not had success in India in terms of a very creative program, either in IT or anything, I would think artificial intelligence and ML will really spur creativity in India, and you would actually have a product possibly in about 5 to 10 years. And I really am thinking that that would be a cornerstone in India, so to speak.
Great. So I think we have come to the end of the session. I believe there are no questions. It's probably too late in India at this point of time for people to prolong it any further. But just concluding remarks. First, I wanted to thank each of the panelists, for your great insights that you have given as far as this most important subject is concerned on funding for innovation and R&D. What I'm also taking away is a great sense of optimism, a lot of positiveness, from all perspectives, whether it's from the government, whether it's from the investment side, or from the industry overseas or within India. Great amount of optimism that there are these elements in place at this point of time, which exist, whether it's talent, whether it's capability, whether it's various schemes from the government. More than anything else, the intent to move forward with innovation, with a great gusto. And all of us have been fortunate, to hear the Prime Minister also give his assurance that that he's committed to making sure that this ecosystem is in play. That's something all of us are looking forward to, because like we kept talking, this whole thing about ecosystem, connecting the dots, making sure that the talent from all areas, right, whether it's from the academics, from the industry, attracting talent from overseas, all these things are very, very important for us, so that when we move along the path of innovation, there'll be plenty of activity going on, a lot of products which will be developed, and a lot of new technologies, right? Artificial intelligence, ML, which the Ramesh was then, and various other platforms which we have the benefit of getting into the cutting edge areas, which we can also move ahead with, cell therapy, gene therapy, through collaboration. I think that's the final part of it. It needs collaboration from all stakeholders to make this happen, and I'm quite positive with the tone that's being set. The summit, certainly it will happen. So thank you once again. Thank you very much for all your insights and inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.